Hello and welcome to another Magic Duels gameplay. Today we're taking a look at an Eldrazi ramp deck, which is red, green and colorless. So the goal of the deck, of course, is to play a bunch of ramp spells that put extra lands into play or generate extra mana. So that way we can cast our expensive Eldrazi a few turns earlier than we're supposed to, and that will help us close out the game. So let's get started here with our 1-drops, where we have Oath of Nissa, single green enchantment that lets us look at the top 3 cards. We can select a creature, land or planeswalker and put it into our hand and the rest on the bottom. In the early game we might need some extra lands, and in the late game Oath of Nissa can help us find a finisher. Moving on, we have Deathcap Cultivator. The important part here is that it's a 2-mana creature that will accelerate our mana, so we can cast a 4-drop on turn 3 because he can add black or green mana to our mana pool, and then later in the game he can also get Delirium, which grants him Death Touch, making him still relevant in combat. Next up we have a Sylvan Advocate, which is a nice card in a ramp deck, since we can play him on turn 2 as a 2/3 with Vigilance, which is already pretty decent, but pretty soon we will get 6 lands or more into play, giving the Sylvan Advocate +2/+2, making him into a 4/5 for just 2 mana. So if we go turn 2 Sylvan Advocate and then turn 3 or 4 play a few ramp spells, we could already have a 4/5 Vigilant Sylvan Advocate on turn 4, which is pretty nice. And next up is our removal spell of choice, Spatial Contortion, 1 generic mana, 1 colorless mana, for an instant that gives a creature +3/-3 until end of turn. The important part here is that we shrink the toughness, so we can kill creatures with 3 or less toughness, and then if we add combat damage into the mix, we can take down even larger creatures, or we could even use this on our own creatures to deal an additional 3 points of damage. So a pretty versatile card and a pretty nice one to have, because otherwise we lack early interaction. And next up is Rolling Thunder. It's in the 2-mana slot, but of course we're casting this for a lot more since it's an X spell. So for X and double red we get to deal X damage divided as we choose among any number of target creatures and or players. So this can go upstairs. If we have 10 mana, the opponent is at 8, we can just kill them, or we can just take out a bunch of creatures. So pretty versatile card, but it's pretty bad in the early game, so that's why we only have 1 copy. Next up is another ramp spell for 2 mana, 1 and a green. We get Rune in their wake, which lets us search for a basic land card, and if we have a wastes in play, then we can put the land we searched into play tapped, otherwise we put it into our hand. So of course the goal is to have a wastes in play, so that way we're actually ramping and putting an extra land into play rather than just in our hand. Next up is Nissa Vastwood Seer, which of course is also pretty nice in a ramp deck, since we'll have multiple lands in play, making it easier to transform her when we have 7 or more lands, and that gives us access to Nissa Sage Animist, which can provide a lot of card advantage with her +1. Speaking of card advantage, we're also playing with a Tireless Tracker, 3 mana for a 3/2 that basically has the ability of a landfall and then investigate. So whenever we play a land, we get to investigate, which means we get a clue token that we can sacrifice for 2 mana to draw a card, and then whenever we sacrifice one of those clue tokens, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on the Tireless Tracker. So as we are drawing more cards, the Tireless Tracker will grow, making it into a larger threat that's more difficult for the opponent to deal with. So usually you play the Tireless Tracker, and then in the same turn you want to play a land, so that you get a clue token right away, and also very nice with Evolving Wilds, since that'll get us 2 landfall triggers. And next up we have 1 copy of Kozilek's Return, 3 mana for an instant that deals 2 damage to each creature, so a nice sweeper effect. And whenever we cast an Eldrazi that costs 7 or more, then we get to exile Kozilek's Return from our graveyard and then deal 5 damage to each creature. So basically first we deal 2 damage, and then later in the game, when we cast a big Eldrazi, we can recast the Kozilek's Return to sweep the board once again, dealing this time 5 damage to each creature. So we're left with 1 big Eldrazi to close out the game. Next up is Nissa's Pilgrimage, 3 mana for a ramp spell that will put a forest into play tapped and 1 into our hand. And then if we have a Spellmaster, we get a second forest into our hand as well. So a nice bit of card advantage there. And next up is our first Eldrazi, Thought-Knot Seer, for 3 generic mana and a colorless mana. We get a 4/4 that when he enters the battlefield we get to look at the opponent's hand, and then we get to exile a non-land card from it. So a nice bit of hand disruption that we usually don't get in Magic Duels, but then when the Thought-Knot Seer leaves the battlefield, the opponent does get to draw a card. But the important part here is that the exiled card remains exiled, so if there's a problematic card, the opponent won't get it back even if they remove the Thought-Knot Seer. Instead they will just draw a random card off the top. So a sizable body that disrupts the opponent while we can keep ramping and casting even bigger threats. Then we have From Beyond, the 4 mana enchantment that puts an Eldrazi sign token into play every turn, and then we can also sacrifice From Beyond to look for an Eldrazi card and put it into our hand. So this will usually find a Kozilek or an Ulamog later in the game, but there's situations where we might want to get another Eldrazi. Next up is Explosive Vegetation, another ramp spell, 4 mana to look for 2 basic lands and put them into play tapped. So this is a nice way to go from 4 mana to 7 mana on turn 5, and if we happened to cast the Explosive Vegetation after casting a 2 mana ramp spell, we could even have access to 7 mana on turn 4, which is pretty awesome. Then we have another Eldrazi, Reality Smasher, 4 generic and a colorless for a 5/5, Trample Haste, and if the opponent wants to deal with the Reality Smasher, they will have to discard an extra card. So a pretty awesome creature that is even better if we can cast it a few turns earlier. Another nice one is Greenwarden of Murasa that returns a card from our graveyard to our hand and does the same when he dies. Then we have Ulvenwald Hydra, which is a new addition from Shadows over Innistrad, 6 mana for a star where its power and toughness is equal to the number of lands we control. It also has reach, so can protect us against flying creatures, and then when the Hydra enters the battlefield we get to look for any land and put it into play tapped. So this will usually look for one of our utility lands like Westvale Abbey or Rogue's Passage that we'll get to in a minute. And next up is Oblivion Sower, which is both a threat and a ramp spell, as we get to exile the top 4 cards of the opponent's library and we get to play any number of exiled lands. This also includes lands that got exiled some other way, but it's usually only gonna be 4. Then we have Nissa's Renewal, another ramp spell for 6 mana, but also gains us 7 life and lets us look for 3 basic lands and put them into play tapped. So this is a nice way to gain a bit of life against aggressive decks, but mainly getting to search up 3 basic lands and put them into play tapped allows us to cast our 10 mana Eldrazi on schedule. Then we've got Chandra Flamecaller, 6 mana for a 4 loyalty planeswalker that can act as a sweeper by dealing X damage to each creature, can refresh our hand with the 0 ability, or can make 2 hasty 3/1 elemental creature tokens that can try and close out the game. Then we also have Omnath, which is a nice red-green payoff card with the landfall ability that puts a 5/5 elemental creature token into play, and then whenever an elemental dies, Omnath deals 3 damage to target creature or player. And we do have a number of elemental creatures besides the tokens and Omnath himself. And then finally we get to our 2 big Eldrazi, Ulamog that exiles 2 permanents when we cast him, and also mills the opponent for 20 when he attacks. And then we have Kozilek, that's a 12/12 menace that draws us a bunch of extra cards and then lets us counter cards from the opponent by discarding cards with the same converted mana cost. And then our mana base, 2 mountains, 7 forests, then 4 wastes, which is important for Rune in their wake, because that one requires to have a waste in play before it can actually ramp us. Then we have 2 Cinder Glade. Then we have Westvale Abbey, which is one of our utility lands. This one lets us spend 6 mana and 1 life to make a 1/1 token, And then we can also pay 5, tap Westvale Abbey and sacrifice 5 creatures to transform Westvale Abbey, and then it becomes Ormondal, Profane Prince, 9/7, a flying, lifelink, indestructible, haste. So a pretty awesome way to close out the game. So we've got 2 copies of Westvale Abbey, then 2 Rootbound Crag, and then 1 Rogue's Passage, which can make our huge creatures unblockable. And then 4 Evolving Wilds, which of course can also grab wastes to enable the Rune in their wake. So that's the deck. Now let's jump into some games and see how the deck does. Alright, let's take a look at our opener, which I think we can do better. This one I will keep, and hopefully our Deathcap Cultivator survives. So here we can Evolving Wilds, and it's actually interesting because if we get a mountain with Evolving Wilds, then we can no longer cast the 2 mana Ram spell next turn, since we'll need both the wastes and the forests. So I think here I'm actually tempted to get another wastes, but then we might not get double red for Chandra, so I think I'm willing to risk not being able to cast our 2 mana Ram spell if we draw it here, and luckily we don't, so now we get to play out our Deathcap Cultivator. We could have just played a forest or a wastes on turn 1 instead of the Evolving Wilds to prevent that problem. But we do want to get these Evolving Wilds out of our hand so that we don't have the issue of tap lands in the future. Looks like we're up against another red-green deck, and this is a very nice draw. Thought-Knot Seer will let us take a look at what the opponent is up to. Alright, so it looks like a Temur colored deck. Bounding Crisis or Pia and Kieran. I think I'm okay with taking Pia and Kieran here, since the flyers are probably going to be more annoying than the Bounding Crisis, which we can just attack into with our 4/4. And of course the 6 drops is also pretty far away. So opponent with 3 mana up. And there's Rune in their wake, which is nice. So I think I'll go to combat first. And our opponent is going to tap down our Thought-Knot Seer most likely, which is fine. And then we can Rune in their wake. And we probably want to get another wastes, but we also have Evolving Wilds, so it doesn't really matter what we get here. I think we basically don't want to get forests, since we do run Nissa's Pilgrimage. So let's put that into play and play out Evolving Wilds. There's also a reason to keep Evolving Wilds in hand in case we find a Tireless Tracker. That'll give us 2 landfall triggers. And the opponent is gonna sit back on the Bounding Crisis. Here I think we get another wastes, since we still have a forest in hand. And Sylvan Advocate is not a bad one. So do we play around a potential counterspell or not? And let's say we do play Chandra. Do we plus her and keep back the Thought-Knot Seer in case our opponent has another Bounding Crisis and wants to try and kill Chandra? I think we run her out there and see what happens. If our opponent has a counterspell, it's not the end of the world. Alright, and now I think plussing is fine. And we keep back the Deathcap Cultivator just in case our opponent does have a second Bounding Crisis, although I guess then they tap down the Deathcap Cultivator and attack Chandra for 6. So there's definitely an argument for keeping back the Thought-Knot Seer, just in case our opponent has another Bounding Crisis. And I think it's actually fine to keep him back, since we are pretty far ahead, and if our opponent can't answer Chandra, then I don't see how they're gonna win this game. Next turn we can play the Advocate, and then an attack with Thought-Knot Seer is fine. Looks like our opponent did not have Bounding Crisis, did not have any counterspells. And Exquisite Firecraft is gonna kill the Thought-Knot Seer. Opponent gets to draw a card, but at least Chandra doesn't die here. And if our opponent attacks Chandra, I think we just let it happen. And then we can plus next turn. Alright, 2 Sylvan Advocates is not bad. So we get to plus attack with Deathcap Cultivator and play 2 Sylvan Advocates. We know our opponent has the Woodland Bellower for next turn, so that'll give them 2 more bodies in play, and they could get another Bounding Crisis with the Woodland Bellower. So that's something to keep in mind. But we still have 2 blockers for the Bounding Crisis, so even if they tap down 1 blocker, we still have the other one. And our opponent is at 6 life. So it's not like they can recklessly attack Chandra. So there's a land number 6 for the opponent. There's Woodland Bellower, which is going to find a green 3-drop. And it is indeed another Bounding Crisis. But no good attacks for our opponent, who's had enough. So let's see here. Westvale Abbey is actually quite nice, since we can play Westvale Abbey. This works out pretty nicely for us. Can play out Westvale Abbey, sacrifice 5 creatures, and get a hasty demon to finish off our opponent. Otherwise it might have taken a few more turns to actually kill our opponent. But there we go. On to the next one. Alright, let's take a look at our opening's hand, which is a bit sketchy here since we don't have the wastes for Rune in their wake unless we fetch it with the wilds, but then we don't have green. So I think we'll have to try another one. And this one looks decent. We have turn 2 Cultivator into turn 3 Vegetation if we draw land. And since we are on the draw, it's pretty likely that we draw one. Still gonna lead with Evolving Wilds, probably getting a Wastes so that we have access to Spatial Contortion. And then we can go turn 2 Forest. Also, if we happen to draw our other ramp spell that requires wastes, then we'll have that in play already to go with the forest. So hopefully our Deathcap Cultivator will survive. Up against a deck with Alchemist Vial and a bunch of colorless lands, so we could be up against some sort of artifact / Eldrazi deck, who knows. But the play here is going to be Cultivator. We did find our 3rd land, so if the Cultivator survives, next turn we could cast Explosive Vegetation, which would get us some red mana. So let's see, opponent with a Mountain into Thopter Engineer. Alright, so they're gonna make a 1/1 Thopter token here, and the Engineer is gonna give all artifacts haste, so the Thopter can attack right away. So we do have Spatial Contortion to deal with the Engineer if we want to. So we could actually this turn, instead of casting the Vegetation, we could cast the Advocate plus use Contortion to deal with the Engineer. That slows down our opponent a little bit, and that also lets us next turn cast the Vegetation, giving the Advocate the 6th land, so that it gets the +2/+2 right away. So I think it's worth it here. So let's cast Spatial Contortion on the Engineer, so that our opponent can't attack with hasty Thopters next turn unless they have a second one. And now we can play the Advocate, and then next turn the Advocate will get +2/+2. And we could, even if we wanted to, also cast a Smasher next turn, which is also reasonable. So let's see here, our opponent with a Vile Aggregate So its power is equal to the number of colorless creature our opponent controls, which obviously also includes colorless artifact creatures like Thopters. And our opponent is going to use Ruins of Aura Reef to put a +1/+1 counter on a colorless creature that entered the battlefield. So now a 3/6, which is pretty big. Alright, so even if this gets +2/+2, it won't be able to actually deal damage to our opponents. If we cast a Smasher, same deal. We have a 5/5, but the 3/6 can just block it. So this might be a turn where casting Explosive Vegetations is fine, as that will give us the mana to cast Oblivion Sower next turn, which gets us closer to Ulamog. So also 2 card types in a graveyard for Delirium, something to keep track of. But I think the play here is just going to be Explosive Vegetation, and then get a mountain and either a second mountain or a wastes. I think I'm gonna go with second mountain here, since we have more double red cards than double colorless cards. Only double colorless card is Kozilek, and we do have Chandra plus the other burn spell that's double red, so no attacks. And hopefully we can exile some lands with the Oblivion Sower next turn. We can of course also just play out our creatures and try and block the Vile Aggregate, but I'm not counting on it, especially with their opponent still having Alchemist's Vial in play. And they have a Pia and Kiran Alar, so that's gonna put 2 more Thopters into play. So that means Vile Aggregate gets bigger. And does our opponent want to attack with the Vile Aggregate? They do. So if we wanted to, we could double block it and kill it, and we would still have 6 lands for the Oblivion Sower. Only downside here is that then we're 1 mana further away from casting Ulamog. And since next turn Oblivion Sower will be able to block the Vile Aggregate, I think I'm okay with taking 5. Of course, there is the argument that our opponent next turn could sacrifice a Thopter with Behind Kiran to kill our Deathcap Cultivator, so we might as well get some value and kill the Vile Aggregate now. So I could see going either way. So we have 6 toughness here, so our opponent can only take out the Sylvan Advocate actually here. So this seems like a decent block. If our opponent wants to kill the Advocate, then the Cultivator still lives. Opponent puts a +1/+1 counter on a Thopter, that's fine. And they are gonna kill the Advocate, which means our Cultivator is still alive. And we drew another land, which is good. So now we can go ahead and cast Oblivion Sower and hope to get lucky. And we got 2 mountains, that's nice. So can't quite cast Reality Smasher, but next turn, let's see, 3, 6, 9, 10, we do have enough mana to cast Ulamog. So if the Cultivator survives, we can cast Ulamog. If our opponent kills a Cultivator and we draw land, we can still cast Ulamog. So we're in a decent spot. But of course our opponent has 2 Foundry of the Consuls, so they have access to a lot of flying creatures, which is a way to kill us even after resolving Ulamog, since Ulamog is not very good at dealing with small Thopter tokens. So here I think we just go for Ulamog, exile Pia and Kiran and exile a Thopter token. We could also go for one of the lands, but I think we will prevent the most damage here by just dealing with a 2/2 flyer and Pia and Kiran. Could not go for Pia and Kiran, but we don't have any way to deal with them in hand. So I think going like this is the best for now. There's also an argument for getting rid of the Alchemist's Vial, since that slows down our clock with Ulamog. But hopefully we can just win with damage and don't have to rely on the mill effect, since we do still have a Smasher in hand. So let's see here, if our opponent can play a Chief of the Foundry, we could be in trouble. They start out with a Bonded Construct, which is fine. And they can put a +1/+1 counter on it with the Ruins of Oran Reef, another Alchemist's Vial. They probably should have cast a Vial first, just in case they draw a Chief of the Foundry. That way they could have still cast a Chief. They're gonna hit us for 4, we take 4, go to 10. And they're gonna leave 1 mana up, at least to prevent Ulamog from attacking. But here we're also just going to cast our Reality Smasher. Opponent does indeed use Alchemist's Vial on Ulamog, so he doesn't get to attack. But everyone else is going to get in there, since we can still play the Deathcap as an additional blocker. So that means we probably tapped our mana wrong here, since we can't both cast a Ruin in their wake and the Deathcap Cultivator. Unless we get a Forest with Ruin in their wake into our hand and then play the Deathcap Cultivator afterwards. So our opponent takes 10 damage down to 5. So I'm going to cast Ruin in their wake, getting a Forest. And I will not use the ability, so that we can just play the Forest and play the Cultivator. So no harm done. And now we're hoping that our opponent can't finish us off. They have 2 cards left. They can still make 2 tokens. They use Alchemist's Vial, I'm not sure why. Alright, I see, Eldrazi Obligator. Did not see that one coming. So our opponent is gonna win the game in style here, stealing our Ulamog and then attacking us to death with our own Ulamog. So had we played around it, we could have left another Cultivator on defense perhaps. That's an interesting way to go out. Alright, let's move on to the next one. Alright, let's take a look at our opener, which doesn't have any ramp spells and only has 2 lands, so it's a bit risky. Let's try another one. Alright, this one has a lot of ramp spells, but doesn't have any action cards, so we do need some help, but at least we'll get up to a lot of mana pretty quickly. And we do have a lot of payoff cards to draw into. Rune in their wake, actually not a bad draw. So here we can go Evolving Wilds to thin out our deck a little bit, get either forests or wastes, and we have plenty of forests, so let's get another wastes. Next turn we can go forest, Rune in their wake, get a mountain, and then we can cast the Pilgrimage. So a decent curve of mana acceleration, just need to find 1 or 2 payoff cards. Opponent with a black-green deck featuring Elvish Visionary, could be all sorts of things. And Kozilek's Return not bad, as it'll buy us a lot of time if our opponent is on an aggressive deck. But here we're just going to cast Rune in their wake, get a mountain, and put it into play tapped. So our opponent could be playing some sort of Aristocrats, Nantuko Husk deck with a lot of sacrifice effects, and Westvale Abbey kind of does indicate that. But now they played their own copy of Nissa's Pilgrimage, which doesn't really fit into that archetype, so maybe our opponent is just playing a black-green ramp deck with Elvish Visionary as an early play, which is definitely reasonable. And here unfortunately we're just gonna have to cast a Nissa's Pilgrimage, get a bunch of forests. Can only get 2 of them since we don't have Spell Mastery quite yet, and play 1 out. So next turn we could already cast Nissa's Renewal, so we'll have access to 10 mana on turn 5. Which is not a bad place to be. And our opponent with Tireless Tracker into a land is not what we want to see here. And they even have an Evolutionary Leap, which is actually not that bad for us here, since now we get to cast our Kozilek's Return, dealing with the Tireless Tracker and the Elvish Visionary, and our opponent doesn't even get to sacrifice any creatures to the Evolutionary Leap. And Omnath is a good draw, of course, but I think we still go with the Kozilek's Return. Our other option is casting the Renewal here, so next turn we can cast Omnath and play a land to enable landfall. But I think dealing with the tracker here is decent enough that we should go for it, and I'm gonna have to do it now so that our opponent can't sacrifice any creatures to the Evolutionary Leap. So let's pause the turn. So next turn we could already cast Omnath and then set up for getting a bunch of landfall triggers with Nissa's Renewal. Then we risk our opponent just killing Omnath and not getting any elemental tokens. Our opponent casts Greenwarden, getting back the Tireless Tracker, which is pretty nice. So they have 4 cards in hand, one of them being Tireless Tracker. We could risk it and just cast Omnath, hope our opponent can't deal with it, and then Nissa's Renewal is going to generate a ton of elemental tokens. Or we can just wait and cast Nissa's Renewal this turn, and then next turn we can play Omnath plus play a land and get 1 elemental token. I think we're far enough behind that we should probably take the riskier line and just go with Omnath, hope our opponent can't deal with it, and then next turn cast Nissa's Renewal. So let's see if our opponent has a removal spell. Opponent is going to sacrifice the Clue, tapping their black mana, so that reduces the chances that they can deal with Omnath. They're just going to replay Tireless Tracker, play a land, get a Clue token. Alright, so looks like Omnath is going to survive. Opponent can get a free attack in with the Greenwarden, we're just going to have to take it. Go to 13, but now we're going to get a ton of elemental tokens, which are definitely going to swing the game in our favor. Plus we're going to gain 7 life, which will keep us alive. So now we get to attack with Omnath. Our opponent could have a pump spell, but I'm not really counting on it. And we should try and get damage in while we can. Opponent is going to block with Tireless Tracker and presumably sacrifice it to the Evolutionary Leap. So it does mean they can't sacrifice a Clue this turn. They get a Gaia's Revenge, which is fine since we have plenty of blockers. And an important thing here is that our creatures are all 5/5, which means a Languish will not be able to kill all our creatures. And it looks like our opponent can't answer our army of elemental tokens and has given up. Smothering Abomination. So it looks like our opponent does have a small sacrifice theme going on. There's a Tireless Tracker again. Copy number 2. And no attacks. Instead, just another Westvale Abbey. Opponent with 3 creatures in play at the moment. And we find a Rogue's Passage, which is nice. So now we can make our Omnath unblockable so that he can attack safely. Another interesting thing here is if we drew our own copy of Westvale Abbey, we would be able to sacrifice 5 creatures, which plays well with Omnath's clause that whenever an elemental we control dies, we get to deal 3 damage. So by sacrificing 5 elementals, we would be able to deal 15 damage to our opponent or to their creatures. But here we're just going to attack with, I believe, everyone. We know our opponent has Gaia's Revenge, but if we attack with these, our opponent has to block at least 2 of them, so we're not at risk of dying to an attack back. And if our opponent does block some of our creatures, we can also deal 3 damage to a creature or player. So yeah, we can only deal 3 damage here to something, so might as well deal 3 to the Abomination instead of our opponent, since they would only go to 2 life. Opponent gets back a card with the Greenwarden of Murasa getting exiled. And our opponent has Gaia's Revenge, which we can block with our 5/5. And that's going to do it. We even have Explosive Vegetation to put 2 more elementals in play, but we ran out of basic lands. So we're gonna have to be happy with our current number of elemental tokens. Make Omnath unblockable, just in case. And that's gonna do it. Alright, I wanna thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this gameplay. And as always, have a nice day.